Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in game number 3 of the 2018 World Chess Championships from London, England, between the champion Magnus Carlsen, who today will have the black pieces, and his opponents Fabiano Caruana playing the white pieces. First two games were both draws. First game lasted 7 hours. Second game, not nearly that long, but still a few hours before they decided to pack it in before the rest day. Yesterday, they did have a full day off just to relax, hang out with their team, figure out a strategy coming for the next 2 days. So Fabiano starts out with the white pieces in game number 3, pawn e4. Much like we saw in game number 1, we see Magnus continuing with the Sicilian defense. Pawn c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. Same line as before. This is how Fabiano wants to attack. Pawn g6, bishop takes. Pawn recapture here on c6, and then pawn d3, followed by fianchetto to g7. The reason going through these fairly fast is they're the exact same moves from game number 1. Feel free to go back and watch that, but this is where things get different, because in game number 1 we saw pawn to h3. This is the main line of what white likes to do here. That's not what Fabiano decides to play. Instead, castle on the king side. Only took about 10 seconds for this move, so you can tell this is part of his preparation. Magnus Carlsen only took about a minute and played queen to c7. If you were watching live, listen to the commentary, you knew that this position, although seems pretty common for white to castle on the king side and right here, this specific place is not really when you see it. You're normally going to see it after pawn to h3, and then only later on would you castle. So Magnus Carlsen may have been caught off guard a little bit. He tended to look around after he saw castle on the king side, but he played queen to c7 fairly quickly, and from here we continue. Rook to e1, pawn e5, and then pawn to a3. In game number 1, we saw more of the bishop to e3 attacking the pawn down here to b6, and then the knight gets involved into the game. Fabiano going for a different approach, maybe later wants to bring his bishop to g5 instead of just here on e3, but first starts with pawn to a3, kind of inviting if his opponent wants to play that pawn to b6. Sure, let's go ahead and push up with pawn to b4 here. I think Fabiano would be okay with that. No reason for Magnus Carlsen to push right here since his pawn on c5 is not under attack. Instead, he decides to go ahead and bring his knight out here to f6. Now Fabiano decides to push with pawn to b4. He has a nice little attack defended by the pawn on a3. Probably part of his, in the back of his mind, thinking that Magnus Carlsen did castle on the queen side of the board after he played pawn to h6. So just wants to make sure that if Magnus Carlsen's trying any of those shenanigans in game number 3, that he starts his push early and often in the game. Magnus Carlsen immediately just decides to castle on the king side. And then from here we see knight to d2. If you kind of look at this pawn looks just ready for the taking. And I think for all intents and purposes, you can just take this right away. And for most people, you really can't. It's a free pawn. Pawn takes here on c5, maybe bishop to e6, getting it involved here, bishop to e3. It is double pawns here on the c file, so later in the game, it is going to be more difficult for white to hold on to the edge that he has. Black definitely has this semi-open file he can bring his rooks over to if he wants to control the center of the board. So in that respect, Magnus Carlsen does have some compensation for giving up that pawn, but mere mortals would have a hard time not just being up a full point from this position. You could start to push your knight here. You're just going to come back, maybe pawn to h3 instead, so you don't have to worry about this. But now your bishop's in a fine spot here. Rook over here to d8 to control that. Knight up here, g5, attacking the bishop. Bishop back to c8. Knight c3. You can tell, even if we're looking at solid moves from black, it's not clear how he's going to get this material anytime soon. So in the game, I feel like we would have just seen the pawn take on c5, but instead knight to d2, followed by bishop down here to g4. Pawn h3 says, yeah, you're going to want to kick that back unless you want to exchange, and that's exactly what we see. Bishop takes here, knight takes. So Magnus Carlsen no longer has the bishop pair on board. Now we see the pawn take on b4, pawn captures here, and then pawn down here to a5. Then we start to see some exchange on board. Pawn takes, now the rook takes, and so you can start to see things are opening up on the queen side of the board. It's going to be very difficult for both sides to hold on to so much material just because it's so easy for both sides to just start exchanging material. Now bishop to d2, attacking the rook there on a5. Rook comes back to a8. Could have just exchanged if he wanted to, but decides to bring it back here. Queen to b1. He has the knight here on f3, attacking the pawn on e5. This pawn on e5 is only defended by the queen on c7. So wants to get the queen more involved into the game, also attacking this pawn on b7, which is also only defended by the queen on c7. So as he's just trying to get a better position, trying to see what material he can attack, figures that the queen here on b1 is a better square. Knight to d7. This does get in a better position to defend this knight or this pawn here on e5. Then we see queen to b4. Really just doing the same thing as before, but more active. Also allows this rook here on e1 to protect this rook on a1 while still attacking the same squares that he was before. Rook to e8, another defender on the pawn on e5. Bishop to c3, attacking that pawn. Pawn down here to b5. Rook takes here. Rook over here to a1, and then we see an exchange. Both sides saying, yeah, we're just going to exchange as much material as we can. And this starts to look like a very drawn game. Both sides do have their most powerful piece, the queen, but they do have two of their minor pieces. They do have both the rooks off the game. It's not clear how either side is going to continue and come up with a victory here. But queen to a7, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here to c3. Queen down to a2, attacking the pawn here on c2. White has a couple options. If he wants to get frisky, play something like queen to e7, say, yeah, you can take my pawn here. I'm going to gobble up your knight. You can start to gobble up my material. Yeah, I can put you in check. Bring your bishop up here to f8. I can get my knight involved. Yes, you're going to check me, get some material here on f2. That's one option. The other option is just to say, you know what? Not going to be doing too much here. I don't see a great line to continue and play queen down to b2, exchange material right here. So from here, we're only 24 moves in. In my opinion, if the players could agree to a draw, they would have. As you know, the rules of the tournament, you cannot draw before 30 moves, so they continue on. f6, then king to f1, getting the kings involved into the game. King to f7, king here e2, knight down here to c5, bishop to c3, knight to e6, just maneuvering the pieces all over the place. Pawn up here to g3, so this is stopping the knight coming down here to f4. You always want to see where your opponents can move. Just stop those pieces from getting to those critical squares, especially nice little outpost, also checking the opponent. Things could have gone poorly for Fabiano if he doesn't block off those squares. Bishop here to f8 wants to get involved. You can see over here on g7, it hasn't moved since it fianchettoed early on, wants to get that piece involved into the game. So bishop here to f8 with the thought of getting it very involved very quickly. Knight down here to d2. Knight to g5, attacking the pawn. Pawn just going to push up here to h4. Comes back to e6. Knight to b3. Pawn down to h5. Bishop down to d2. And then bishop to d6. You can see both sides not really making much headway in the game, but they are moving around. See if they can just find a small advantage and take control. White continues with pawn to c3. And then c5, bishop here, e3, king e7, king down here to d1. And interesting, but you could just see how Fabiano is maneuvering his king over to the queen side of the board. Just doesn't want to put it on dark squares. It's the same amount of moves to come over here, but he recognizes his opponent does have a dark square bishop. So don't even have to think about it. Put it all on light squares. Pawn to f5, king back here to d1. And then the pawn takes here, pawn down to c4, forcing the knight to move. We see the knight to c5, bishop takes, and then bishop recaptures. At this point, they have gone past 40 moves. They do get 50 additional minutes added on. So what do both players do? They get up and they leave to take a break. And this happens quite a few times when they know they are in a theoretical drawn position. It's going to be very difficult for either side to come out with this a victory, but they've just been playing for hours now and they're just tired, and so they just get up and they just left. They eventually did come back, and from here they didn't play too many moves past this. King to e2, c6, knight to f1, pawn down to b4. We do see an exchange on the board. And then it was interesting how Fabiano decided to take, instead of, he could have just taken pawn to f5, would have still been a draw, but instead decided to play knight takes on c4, forcing the king to take here. After pawn takes on f5, 49 moves, we do have a drawn game. Black, if he wants to stop this pawn from pushing, he's going to have to focus his bishop and his king on that. He's not able to stop the king coming and taking material here on h5. If he does want to protect this, he's going to have to just let this pawn push up the board. So this is going to be a drawn game. No way to really continue past this. So game number 3 is in the books. Magnus Carlsen, I feel like, has to be feeling good because he's only had white once, had black 2 times, and we have 3 draws so far. So as most of the big tournaments we follow, it's draws early on. That's just to be expected, or at least is what I expected. I am expecting Magnus Carlsen, though, to come out in the next game with something special. At least that is my hope. But thank you guys so much for watching the commentary for game number 3, and I'll see you tomorrow for game number 4.